A good and lovely Tuesday afternoon, and welcome to our second Youth Research Dialogue in 2024. In case you're not familiar with the Youth Research Dialogues, the RAY network is implementing this series on the discussion of evidence-based youth research findings since 2021. My name is Carmen Teubel-Kiviniemi. I'm the project manager and the coordinator of the European Youth Research Network RAY, which is hosted by the Finnish National Agency for Education. Our network involves national agencies implementing the European youth programs and national research partners from 34 partner countries. Today, we will take a closer look at one of the priorities of Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps, inclusion and diversity. Today's dialogue is also still part of our so-called RAY monitoring editions. Just as a reminder, these editions focus on the newest findings from the RAY monitoring service conducted with beneficiaries of the European youth programs from June to October last year. Today we will discuss these RAY monitoring findings related to the inclusion and diversity priority, as well as a recent research published by the SALTO Inclusion and Diversity Resource Center on Making Erasmus Plus and the European Solidarity Corps more inclusive. Insights from both analyses, including the implementation of the European youth programs, profiles of participants, learning outcomes, impact, and as well as methodology and terminology used, are amongst the discussion topics today. The RAY Transnational Research Team is represented today by Ashley Pitschmann. Ashley works for Youth Policy Lab, a small research agency and think tank in the youth sector. Her work within RAY focused on a number of projects, including the impact of the corona pandemic on youth work development, on capacity building, as well as monitoring the effects and outcomes of the European youth programs. Our guest speaker on behalf of SALTO Inclusion and Diversity is Gisele Evrard. Gisele's involvement in youth work goes way back 30 years ago when she started as a volunteer, working then later for European institutions, international networks and platforms. For example, she acted as a coordinator for the SALTO Training and Cooperation Resource Center for 6 years. Currently, she is a freelance consultant focusing on facilitating processes, particularly on teams and organizations development. I'm really great and happy that both of you are here with us today. Our team today is Lena Surpe, our moderator, and Domagoj Moric, our digital facilitator. And that's from my side. Have a great dialogue, and now to you, Lena.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lena Surpe, and I will be your moderator today. Welcome to this dialogue also from my side. In today's dialogue, we are dealing with a particularly important and topical theme, that is the theme related to the inclusion in the European youth programs. The world is a more unpredictable place for young people to live and to grow than it has been for a long time. Europe is engaged in an intensifying struggle over all kinds of borders. And I'm not talking about the state or national borders only, but also cultural, social, economic, and racialized borders, to mention a few. In an era of global insecurities and fractures, the question of inclusion as a right and source of well-being for young people is increasingly important and, by definition, also a more controversial theme. Nevertheless, I think that it is in the actors in the youth field who have a special social and societal responsibility to engage in discussion on how every young person's right to live, act, and influence in communities and in society is realized equally, regardless of their background, social status, and resources. This is a huge responsibility, of course, and it's not a simple one. It requires us to recognize the structures and practices of intersectional inequalities and to listen carefully to the experiences of young people, even those that are easily kept silent, as well as those who work with young people in the youth field. Today, we will be able to discuss this topic, focusing especially on Erasmus Plus Youth and European Solidarity Corps programs and the research monitoring results obtained. I look really forward to our guest speeches and our discussion. Before we go into the presentations, I would like to remind the audience of the great possibility to join the dialogue. We invite you to ask questions either on the Facebook or YouTube chat or via Slido. Simply go to slido.com and type in the code which is now displayed on the screen. And now to the presentations. Please, Gisele, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you. Thank you for having me and giving me the chance to share a little bit of the main insights that we had from the research that SALTO Inclusion and Diversity did on looking at the inclusiveness of the European Youth Programme. So perhaps first to share a little bit data, which my colleague Ashley might also come back to afterwards, to show that if you look at the program periods, and especially the first one until 2020, we can see that if we look at Solidarity Corps projects and Erasmus Plus Youth, we have, or they represent about 27 to 34% of approved projects, with about 40% of participants being young people with fewer opportunities, or so-called young people with fewer opportunities. And these 40% come from a total of 20 to 25% of participants, if we look at the engagement of youth in the program. So it's quite an impressive number. And if we look at the period till 2023, there you can also see that in Solidarity Corps and Erasmus Plus Youth, we have about 24 to 56, which is enormous percent of projects that focus on inclusion and diversity. So I think that gives already quite good picture of how inclusion and diversity is present in the projects, in the programs. The main insights that came from the research is that a lot of things have been done to improve the dimension of inclusion and diversity in the program, and it's very much appreciated. Most of the national agencies have now an inclusion and diversity strategy, which helps a lot at the national level also to support and reaching out. There are new profile of applicants. So things are moving, but of course, much more still need to be done. The program are seen as tools that can really foster inclusion and diversity in European youth work. The Solidarity Course, shows a very strong impact at the community level, but the one-size-fits-all approach for application forms, budgets, or budgets in general needs to change. And exactly now we can see a few recommendations that came out of the research. I will skim through the main ones. Clearly make things easier, small and flexible grants, especially those that can be managed by NAs, because they know their groups, they know their youth work context at the national level. Simplified forms, bigger budget for the Solidarity Corps, and for inclusion projects in general, because what we've noticed is that inclusion projects do require really a lot of efforts and a lot of times, which are not yet sufficiently covered by the existing budgets, even with simplified measures already in place. Quality matters, so it's not about the number of young people with opportunities involved in the program or in the programs, but really about the quality of the inclusion initiatives. structural change versus individual integration. We might tackle that later on in the dialogue, but it's especially about looking at changes from a much more systemic perspective rather than having mini patch and mini solutions here and there. A few more recommendations about understanding, addressing barriers to inclusion. Obviously, that goes without saying, and I don't think it requires a lot of explanation. It's a sine qua non condition to be able to tailor the program or both programs for inclusion and diversity. Specific inclusion budgets are needed. As I said before, there has been a lot of improvement already towards the financial support, but it needs to be even more tailored and increased. A topic that we might also approach later is really this sensitivity to the use of labels and the pros and cons. Pros is that it sheds light on groups that are not represented or underrepresented or underprivileged, but at the same time, it stigmatized also even more a situation that is already complicated to live on a day-to-day. And the last but not least, this is a Ray dialogue and connects very much to this question of having better monitoring and evaluation systems. The tools that are used at the moment are not good enough or tailored enough to support exploring how inclusion and diversity evolves. And then the final two are about Discover EU Inclusion, which is a special measure for young people with few opportunities, but that unfortunately, because of its structure, at the moment doesn't fully achieve its intentions. And the last point or the last recommendation is about not forgetting about the neighboring partner countries, which play an important role when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about diversity, and when we talk about building together a resilient Europe. Even if they are not part of the EU, they are still part of Europe, and they are around Europe as well, so they have to matter as well. I think this is for the main recommendations that I could share in such a concise presentation, but we will have time to discuss a bit later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gisele, for your very important and interesting speech, which at the same time inspired some critical remarks and also hope. And now we move directly to our second speaker, who is Ashley. Please, Ashley, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I today will take you a little bit through the Ray monitoring surveys data, particularly the inclusion and diversity module. And I'll take a look first at some contextualizing numbers for the data to understand the numbers we're looking at. And then I'll present data on the learning outcomes, barriers to inclusion, and after project effects before we move into our discussion here. So first, some contextualizing information about the Erasmus Plus side of the data. We had 7,522 complete response, of which we calculated about 32.3% were categorized as young person or young people with fewer opportunities based on an attribute that is given to us, reported to us by the Commission from organizations. While on the solidarity, and then we have, and then from the diversity inclusion module itself, we had 1,559 respondents to that, of which 35.5% are respondents with young people with fewer opportunities. Then on the solidarity core for volunteer projects, we had 2,510 complete responses. And for the solidarity core, we don't have a specific attribute that directly marks young people with fewer opportunities in our data. So we instead have used a proxy question about fair share of opportunities. And based on that, we see that about 29% of the respondents can be categorized as young people with fewer opportunities from the complete responses. For the diversity inclusion module, because of the modularization, it's of course a little bit of a smaller number of 258 respondents, with about 26% of the respondents being categorized as young people with fewer opportunities. So young people with fewer opportunities are represented in the inclusion module in a similar way to the entire data set, but they will not be the focus of my project. So I will then talk about now the Erasmus Plus learning outcomes. For the Erasmus with youth participants, we see that democracy, diversity, and European values are the highest, with all above 60% for I learned something about. When we look at the I also learned something about question, over 50% of the youth participants said they learned about acceptance, critical thinking, dimensions of inequality, empathy, and equality, all above 50%, being the highest one. When we look at the solidarity cores and the volunteering projects, inclusion is by far the largest emphasis there, with well over 70%, followed, of course, by democracy, diversity, and European values, all over above 50%. There's also a similar pattern for the from the Erasmus Plus as well, with this volunteering projects. Oh, sorry, could you go back? Thank you, where we see the dimensions of inequality, critical thinking, non-discrimination, acceptance, and empathy over 50%. So the learning outcomes are relative to inclusion and diversity for both the Erasmus Plus and the Solidarity Core projects, volunteer projects. Now, next slide, please. We ask a question of participants in both project types, program types, about observing or experiencing barriers to inclusion, and actually 75% of participants in both programs said that they observed or experienced barriers to inclusion. But when these barriers to inclusion were observed or experienced from the Erasmus Plus side, we see that 53% strongly agreed that they managed to overcome these barriers. And from the Solidarity Core side, that's about 46% strongly agreed to overcome these barriers. Now, finally, after the project, where we talk about what they did with their learning and experience. And we see here on the Erasmus Plus side that the more than before option was selected by about 53% of respondents for I actively support diversity, I actively stand up against discrimination and intolerance, and I actively stand up for my rights after the project, which is this yellow bar here. While the same extent is around 43%. So we're not seeing any sort of going back, which is a good sign. And then from the Solidarity Core projects, for the volunteering programs, we see also very similar, with a slight difference. Around 55% of respondents chose the more than before the project option for I actively support diversity and I actively stand up against discrimination and intolerance, while the I actively stand up for my own rights is at 60%, which is quite high. And we can say then, when we see from this, that there's a very much an empowering effect from these projects, where actively addressing issues related to inclusion and diversity become more aware for both participants in the programs. And with that information, I think we can start our discussion then.
Thank you, Ashley, a lot for your informative and very efficient speech. A lot of information in a couple of minutes. Yeah. And now we have time to discuss a little bit more in detail based on your presentations and all the results you have in your package what comes to inclusion of the European youth programs. We have a couple of topics we would like to take up, and then the audience, please take your floor as well and be proactive, and we take your questions if you have anything to raise during our discussion. But let's start with the broad question of which you already somehow, of course, referred to, how these youth programs approach inclusion and diversity. How comprehensively they really take the inclusion as a phenomenon and also as a concept. And perhaps we could a little bit go through this question of terminology used in the programs. Do we use, or do the programs use, appropriate terms, concepts, and categories that allows us to identify the critical dimensions of inclusion for today's young people and those who work with them? And if not, how would you like to develop the concepts and terms used in order to be in today's world in an appropriate way? How would you like to comment on that?
Shall I start?
Shall you? Yeah.
Well, to answer perhaps or comment on your first question, Lina, from the interviews and focus groups we had, it's clear that the programs have addressed inclusion and diversity much more than before. So there is really an improvement in terms of the space given to it, simplification of grants for some type of projects, lump sums, accreditation. So there's a number of elements that have been put in place to ease the access of participants and beneficiary organizations. But at the same time, there is still a sort, and I mentioned it in my presentation, of one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't work with inclusion. Inclusion really needs to have system that can be tailored and adjusted, and more should be in the hands of NAs who know their field, and they can be more proactive. So this is very clear that improvements have to be made about that. And then, yes, there is the question of terminology or labels that are being used. What I've heard a lot is about, are we talking about integration? Are we talking about inclusion? Are we talking about diversity, equality, equity? Is inclusion a means or is inclusion an end? And I didn't really get one, I would say, common position on that. And it's normal because it's also contextual. But generally, what came out is that organizations are not very comfortable with labeling their participants young people with few opportunities. They are also not happy having a EU inclusion specifically for young people with few opportunities to travel, because inclusion means to interact with other groups. So if you make projects where you just have that profile of participants, we are missing out a little bit the rest. So there is no solution, and the use of labels is necessary, but it is really a question about, can we make changes that are more structural, more systemic, and make sure that the programs are literally open to all. I think that's more the reflection behind. Yeah. Sorry, I hope I wasn't too long, but yeah.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Gisele. I think you somehow approached this very complex question in a comprehensive way, tackling also ethical questions. This is not only a practical or social or even political matter, but it's also an ethical matter, and very important reply. We have an audience question. I think, Ashley, perhaps you can somehow incorporate that to your answer as well. And the question is, what approach would you suggest in terms of labeling issue? Well, we have been discussing that already. Can we do research on inclusion without using terms like young people with fewer opportunities? So from the research perspective, how do you see this issue?
Right. Just speaking a little bit more open, general, I would say that in a comprehensive sense, we see from the data that there's a very high level of learning about inclusion. There's a high level of awareness and a high level of empowering effects, and that's very good to see in the program. It is, I think, a good step. And this question, of course, is labeling and how to. It's, of course, a question all researchers have. How do you research something without a definition or a label or a concept? And you want your concept to be open enough that it captures what you're trying to research, but constricted enough that it's not capturing everything. So, you have this idea of concept stretching, and then you have a term like young people with few opportunities. What does that really mean? There is a definition that talks and tries to capture the complexity of integration or inclusion and diversity and the multifaceted and intersectional ways in which there could be barriers to a person participating in the European youth programs. And I think it's a lot as just as there's no single solution or single answer to this. It depends so much on the context. For different NAs or different cultural contexts, where labeling a young person as a young person with fewer opportunities or a marginalized person could have, even safety concerns. And you can't then ignore, of course, the context in which this research and this data needs to be collected, especially if you're doing interviews and things like that. There's always going to be an emphasis from us to anonymize as much as possible, really eliminate any way of tracing it back to that specific person if we do an interview or a focus group or things like that, because inclusion and diversity is as much a concept as it is an experience for young people. And you have to be aware of that as researchers all the time. That helps.
Yeah, well, that's true. I was somehow thinking about one political scientist who I really appreciate, Nancy Fraser, who has said that, well, equality and equity is about recognition, representation, and redistribution. I think we are discussing about that quite a lot. And it's both an intergenerational and intergenerational, cross-generational matter, as you were discussing. Here is another question, perhaps it's a little bit more concrete. Is there a difference in the standing up for yourself questions or answers between young people with few opportunities and young people without that label, based on your data? How do you comment on that question?
Funny enough, no. It was actually something I was discussing with some researchers. Is in a lot of these questions we see when we divide it up between the young people with fewer opportunities and those who don't have the label, is a lot of the empowering effects are pretty universal for young people. So we see that I think was a good sign of the programs is that the experience is relatively the same as for all experience. We see a little bit higher learning outcomes for young people with fewer opportunities, but these actively standing up and facing discrimination and empowering effect is carried out through both groups, or as many groups. And I think that speaks really great to the program itself, and that it's an equal experience for those who come in.
I can only subscribe to that from what I've heard for the research of SALTO inclusion and diversity, but also through other projects that we are running at the moment, is that increasingly it seems that young people are more and more aware of their rights, their responsibilities, what they can claim and so on, but it's not one group versus another one, or one more than another one. It seems to be something evolving in general. Yeah.
That's really good to hear. I think it's hope inspiring. I was thinking about one particular piece of result you showed, Ashley. According to your results, it seems that these programs clearly strengthen the participants' critical thinking and understanding of structural factors of inequality. And I think it's a very important piece of results. Would you like to somehow elaborate on that? And I was also thinking about the weak awareness of the solidarity based on your data, that it somehow it doesn't tackle the question of dimension of solidarity, this critical thinking. So how would you like to elaborate on that?
I think I would say for this idea of building critical thinking and understanding of structural factors, I always have the saying that when we know better, we do better. And so it's great to see that there's such a great emphasis on that, because the more that you learn about structural inequalities, the more that you learn and are trained to look critically at your environment and the context that you're in, to see what you can do, that's the very first step in making actual changes. You have to recognize the problems before you can create solutions. In terms of the differences between the solidarity care, for this is the volunteering programs that we're talking about. So they're not the same as the solidarity project. So there's, of course, probably more of an emphasis for the solidarity part of it. But I think solidarity can also mean very different things to the young people. Is it solidarity within the community? Is it solidarity at a European level? And that is not something that we specify in our data. We have just solidarity and we leave it up to the participants. So it could be that the response is very low because it's understood in a more European context than it is understood in a community context. And that is just something we can't really delve into with our larger data sets, but is something that qualitative data could perhaps help us answer.
Yeah, thank you. I think you are completely right in that fluidity of the concept of solidarity, and perhaps that somehow is seen also in the results. Gisele, I was thinking about one of your very important things you took up in your presentation, that while we are recognizing the growing problems of structural inequalities in Europe, we still seek mostly individual solutions to them. And I think that is something very, very important, even complex matter. And I would like you to elaborate it a little bit more. And I would like to incorporate, before you answer, the one question which we have here, and it has to do with terminology, but also somehow the structural dimension of inequalities. As it was mentioned, the terminology depends on the context, probably national. Can each program country create more clear definition of who is considered a young people or young person with fewer opportunities. And I think this has to do with the great diversity in how we understand diversity data across Europe.
I can start from the end, so from this point, and it's my opinion. I cannot pretend to speak on behalf of everyone, of course, but the fact that national agencies have now inclusion and diversity strategy is the first answer to that question, because they do tailor their strategy. Of course, the European dimension is there, the impulses are there, but at the same time, they try to look at the reality at the national level, at the regional level, even at the rural level, if possible. So there is already an attempt in a strategic but also operational way to address better inclusion and diversity at the national level. What is important to keep in mind, and that's the challenge when we talk about labels or concepts, is that national agencies depend on national authorities who have rules and procedures that are not in the hands of NAs to change. And the question of ethics, or the question of organizations resisting sometimes to even tick the box of young people with few opportunities, is because they have to provide a lot of very intimate information about their participants that go even sometimes to the level of how much the parents are earning. And that's not because NAs wants to know that, it's because at the higher level, it's part of the regulation. So the change has to happen also there. It's not about making sure that we reach more participants, that we have, I don't know, more categories or higher number. We really need to have a big zoom out process at the national level and at the European level, and really see what are the patterns, what are the failures that we see keep on repeating as barriers to inclusion and diversity, listen to what they tell us, address them, and change at really a wider structural level. At the moment, we do what we can. We have to appreciate what we managed to do already, but it's still very much looking at the individual, reaching that young person, I don't know, supporting that learning process of that young person, and then look at numbers and see, well, how things have evolved. But I think it has to be seen from a very, very much wider perspective. And that's what will support structural change at the national and European level. It's a quite complex question and answer, but that's definitely the core of, hopefully, future very passionate debates to have.
Yeah, thank you, Gisele. Yeah, you're totally right. And I think it's a huge question ranging from political dimension to the question of methodology. How do we approach young people, and how do we create our research design in order to somehow tackle this question of individualization of structural problems, as you mentioned. Ashley, would you like to comment on Gisele's reasoning? Or?
No, I think I completely agree. I think I kind of agree. It's very similar. You have to zoom in on like these individual stories, and from there build up to the structural awarenesses that are inhibiting or enabling certain circumstances. So it's always like a process of in and out to understand how all of these complexities interplay into one another to solve a problem that is multifaceted, it's intersectional, it's so many things and everything all at once, it feels. So I completely agree.
Thank you. Well, if we go into this complexity of structural problems versus individual solutions, how these programs should be developed in terms of their activity types or budgeting or application procedures. What would you like to suggest to enhance the accessibility and also this critical reflection on structures versus individual solutions? What would you like to see in the future? Who would like to start?
Yeah.
Ashley, please.
Yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about definitely the methodology. At Ray, we're developing a project that we're trying to look at who's missing in the European youth programs, which is a research question that is a very difficult question to even to think about. Is like, how do you look at who's missing when you have a data set? And it's sort of like our Ray Miss project as it is. We really want to look at least at the organizational level and at the application level to see what are the structural barriers that is even preventing young people or organizations from participating in the European programs before like anything else, like the very first step where they have decided to apply or not? How are we missing them already? And how can we address that at a structural level? And so I think sometimes you need to find the answers before the questions are really even there,
Yeah.
which is very difficult from a research perspective. So we're very excited about this project, and hopefully we'll have another research dialogue in a year or two where we can talk about these these results.
Yeah, a very important issue on sociological imagination as well, how to how to create these things before we have even asked them. Yeah, Gisele, would you like to continue on from that?
I can add a little bit, and I agree with Ashley about trying to find the answers before even you get the material to formulate them. I know that from the side, or I heard from the side of national agencies, for instance, that this is also very much connected with monitoring and evaluation. There is not yet enough supportive tools that allow looking at what's missing, not only who is missing, but what's missing in terms of measures or sub-priorities that they could put in place. So this is really one of the things that they ask, is to have tools that are more supportive, especially if we look at inclusion and diversity, which could help already a little bit about when it comes to about how the program should be shaped, basically to support better inclusion and diversity. And then it's what I said already. It's the profiles are changing. Accompanying measures are necessary. They take time. They use a lot of time. Organizations who are specialized can be formidable partners in doing that, but they need support. They need financial support as well. So the whole grant or the whole funding mechanisms need to be also adjusted to the needs that inclusion projects require. And then in general, when it comes more to the, not necessarily to the fact of having several priorities that are at the same level in the program or in both programs, but more in the design of the application and funding mechanisms. We could see that during the European Year on Youth, that small grants that could be managed by NAs given very easily would help a lot to ease the whole process and put less pressure on administrative procedures. So something like that in the future programs could be taken into account and would support. It's just little things. It's not about these big structural changes we were talking before, but it would help indeed.
Thank you. I really hope your wise suggestions will be heard. and I thank also the audience, who's very active one. And I take one question, which I think is a very important one, what comes to the inclusiveness of European program as well. And it has to do with digital transformation. And the person is asking, is this something that was somehow present in these replies, and is this supporting inclusion, that is digital transformation, or rather the opposite? Any findings, or too early to ask? So what is the meaning and implications of digitalization in terms of inclusion?
Maybe I can mention something about that. It's not an answer to the question as such, but at least we could see through the research project that there are two big dimensions that are very closely linked to inclusion, and it's solidarity, but heavily connected, and digital transformation, I don't feel able to answer whether it supports inclusion or rather the opposite, because like a coin, it has two sides always. So what we notice, and also again in other processes, is that digital transformation, but also AI, VR, and so on, is and will probably allow people who would not participate, who would not move, to be present, to exchange, to meet with others, to experience things in a different way. So in that sense, yes, it supports inclusion, but of course, at the same time, you can say, yeah, but it supports isolation, you have to be literate, and so on. So I think the two things coexist, fortunately or unfortunately, because they also nourish each other when it comes to responses to give. But definitely it was present in the research, that I can say. Yeah.
Thank you. Ashley, would you like to add something on that?
I would say from the inclusion and diversity module, we can't really say much about that. We know some information from the Corona study where we had on youth work, where they talked about digitalization and digital transformation. And it's very much, as Gisele said, it's a double-edged sword, sort of. You had a lot of young people who felt excluded from youth work before, saying that now they had access to it because there was a hybrid or an online component that allowed them to access youth work without having to leave home. And then, of course, you had on the other side young people in rural climates who said that they had a very difficult time accessing digital tools and any sort of digital youth work because they didn't have the infrastructure to then sign on, or their internet wasn't strong enough for this. So it's, of course, very complicated. The digital transformation, I think, could be as much a tool as a hindrance, as with many things we see in this discussion here. And it's, I think, a little too early to say, and I can't really speak too much, but we do have a project on digitalization as well that we're researching, that the report should be coming out soon. So I say wait and find out.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question is also very huge, this whole question of inclusion and digitalization and how they are interacting. And I think it's a very generational one as well. And my generation and the young generation understand the question completely differently. So I think this is something to really, which is very important for us to discuss with young people themselves, and really understanding the experiences of young generation in terms of that. But I think we are ready to go towards the end, not ready in this discussion. I mean, the topic will be heated after this very good dialogue, but now in order to have time to raise our suggestions to the political decision makers as well, I would like to ask both of you, if it were up to you, what would be the message related to inclusion issue in these European youth programs that you would particularly like European decision makers to hear on the basis of your research findings? Now you can take all your power and take up these suggestions. Ashley, please.
I would say that it's important to recognize that the learning and empowering experience in the youth programs is there, and it's a good one. And it seems that no matter what your minority status, marginalization status, socioeconomic disadvantages, that it's true for all participants. And so let's figure out ways of examining the structures that hinder that multiplication effect for youth, and trying to get those young people involved who are missing out, who could be benefiting.
Do you think that our framework, youth policy framework in Europe, is sensitive enough to this suggestion you were taking up? Or should the framework, should it be changed as well?
Well, when you're talking about changing frameworks, there's a lot of political implications involved in that as well, of course. I think there's always time for reflection and improvement, even if it is as complex and as difficult as we have discussed here. And so every time should be the time to relook at the framework if we notice that it's not working the way we want it to.
Yeah, we return back to the question of how to make structures change as well. But I think it's a particular responsibility for us and those who are not only working in the youth field, but also field of youth policy to take these questions you have been mentioning really seriously. But I think we are in the forefront of making Europe more inclusive, and I think it's a particular responsibility also of youth policy people to take these questions seriously, and of course they do that as well. Gisele, what would you like to send? What kind of message?
I have two sides of me, the activist one and the other one that are debating now. I would say, thanks to to all the achievements we could already document in a way or another through RAY, but also through other forms of monitoring. We know that the programs really have a unique contribution to youth work development. This is not questioned anymore. So that's something that really needs to be embraced and celebrated, even with all its flaws and challenges and still remaining obstacles. It's moving. So I think that's an important message. But then it's also that there is, I think, policymakers, and I'm not talking about NAs because they are on boards, but policymakers who are not on boards, they do not have the right not to care. For me, it should not be a choice. And for this, I think the two policymakers, but also youth organizations need to work more and more together. They need to be in touch. They need to exchange. This is how recognition will come. This is now how cooperation will enhance. And that's probably one of the challenges to address in the future. So you talk about the European policymaker, but I see that very much at the local level as well, where information have to flow differently, communication have to flow differently. That's their responsibility to put mechanisms in place so that it can happen, but organizations have their role to play as well. So I think this is really the message. It's like, it might sound cheesy, but together we can, and we have to. So let's do it.
Thank you, Gisele. I think that these words were very good words to finish our great discussion. Thank you so much, Ashley and Gisele, for your wise and inspiring speeches and this dialogue. And thank you for the audience for your very many questions. And we couldn't take all of them right now, unfortunately, due to our time limit. But we will answer these questions later on in the Facebook chat. So be there, and thank you so much. The discussion on inclusiveness of European youth programs will certainly continue. Thank you, and see you later on.
Thank you for joining the dialogue also from my side. In case if you or your colleagues want to rewatch this youth research dialogue, it will be available on our social media and also on the RAY website.
Thanks a lot, Lena. Thanks a lot to Margoj for implementing this dialogue. From my side, I hope the audience is joining us for our next Youth Research Dialogue, which is on the 8th of April, and it will be still part of our RAY monitoring edition, so we will still talk about RAY monitoring findings. Any updates on our website and our social media pages, so check them out from time to time. And that's from our side. Thanks a lot for joining, and see you soon.